Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Energy Talk podcast. My name is Olubumi Alajide, and thank you for joining me again to the podcast where we share stories and innovations about the energy industry. Today, we're talking about a topic I've wanted to cover for a very long time now. We're talking about decentralized renewable energy, and we're talking with an individual that knows a lot about this. His name is William Brent, and he works with Power for All as their communications director, and he works with them. He's been working with them for a very long time. So Power for All are a non-profit, and they do lots of work with renewable energy companies and sustainable development projects. And it's a thing that collects like social responses and actual data for projects that involved bridging the divide in energy poverty, and especially through the technology of decentralized renewable energy. So you're going to hear a lot of interesting points from our conversation, and most especially how to communicate the impact of what this technology has in terms of rural electrification and for reaching people which don't have electricity for the very first time. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that's something I'm really passionate about. This topic about energy access and the Sustainable Development Goal 7. So without further ado, just let us jump right into the podcast and listen to my conversation with William. Before I go, don't forget to follow us on social media and rate and subscribe to the podcast anywhere you're listening. So without further ado, let's jump into the talk with William.
My name is William Brent. I'm based in Barcelona, and I am the Chief Communications Officer, Chief Engagement Officer for Power for All, which is a nonprofit focused on ending energy poverty. I've been with Power for All since the beginning, about 5 years now. And prior to that, I was a bit of a mutt, as we say. I'm a dog lover, so maybe your listeners won't know that reference, but a mutt is just a dog of mixed breed. So my history in professional life has been a bit of a mix as well. I started out early on as a foreign correspondent and editor. I worked in China for many years. And then I was an entrepreneur involved in a number of different startups, a digital agency, a film production company, an internet company. And then after getting out of sort of the entrepreneurial world for a while, I joined a big global marketing services public relations firm called Interpublic Group and worked for them for a decade, where I started their climate solutions renewable energy practice and consulted to. And so basically consulted for any range of companies and nonprofits and organizations focused on how to better use resource, whether it's energy or materials or transportation related technologies. So I did that for 10 years and then I quit. I moved my family to Spain where I took some time off, and then a friend of mine was starting Power for All in San Francisco and asked if I wanted to join. So here I am. And it's really been fascinating because I've worked overseas for about half of my life, but I've never really worked in India and other parts of South Asia, and never worked or even been to anywhere in Africa. So for me, this has been a really interesting journey, and it's allowed me to really, start to get to know the different countries in Africa, the culture there, and work on issues that I can tell are really making a difference.
Here, so you spent most of your career in media, so it pretty much makes sense that you're in the role you are today. But I have another question. Your last role, was that the first time you were involved with anything related to the climate or anything related to renewable energy? Was that the first time, or how did you transition towards that initially?
Yes, that's a good question. And it was intentional. I've been involved, as you said, in media, communications, entertainment, when I was in China. But the longer I stayed in China, I spent 15 years in China total. And as I essentially grew up there from my early 20s onward, uh, and watched their trajectory for economic development, I realized that, of course, they're going to do whatever they need to do to improve the lives of the Chinese people, and they're entitled to do that. But what I realized was that, China at such a scale of 1 billion people if they were to take the same path that the United States and other countries that the industrialized first took, that everybody, including myself, including my children, um, would really suffer, and that we needed to really focus, and I needed to really focus on issues around sustainability for me to feel like I was making a contribution in the world. So when I moved back to the United States, it was a very intentional decision on my part to try and get involved in the world of sustainability. And that ultimately led me to start working in renewable energy and climate solutions.
That's quite a story. So I think this transitions very well to talking about Power for All, which is where you're currently working with. So could you just give a brief preview of what Power for All is and what its goals are, what operations it has, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia? I think it's only India that you guys are in Southeast Asia. Oh, you can tell me about
Yeah,
it
well,
more
so
as
as I
well.
mentioned, I mean, we are a campaign that's focused on ending energy poverty as quickly as possible. But specifically within the whole issue around energy poverty or access to energy, we're very focused on what we call decentralized renewable energy. These are distributed renewable energy systems, solar home systems, mini grids, standalone applications to power uh, water irrigation for agriculture. We, as a campaign, feel very strongly and have built out the case of evidence to prove it that decentralized distributed renewable energy systems are going to be critical for achieving universal electricity access by 2030, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, but also to improve lives of the nearly billion people who don't have access to electricity by giving them means to improve their livelihoods, start new businesses, create um, scale for productive endeavors that they might be involved in, whether it's welding or agricultural farming or whatever it may be. So our campaign is very much focused on trying to legitimize and accelerate the role of these solutions. And then, that's true for our work in Asia and in Africa. Africa, without doubt, is the biggest opportunity to make a difference through these types of solutions. Of that 800, 900 million people without access to electricity, about 600, 650 million of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's where the biggest need is, and that's where our biggest focus is. And so we work in a variety of different ways, but mainly three areas. We have a research team that works very closely with our communications team. So that's sort of one bucket where we're looking to build evidence and communicate that in a more powerful way to create a stronger narrative for the sector. We do a lot of advocacy work at the global, regional, and national levels to ensure that multilateral organizations, regional organizations, and national governments are giving the attention that these decentralized solutions deserve. And then we also work with multiple stakeholders at the national level, country level, and even subnational levels to try to identify barriers to market growth and remove them so that these solutions can scale even faster.
Mm. This must have been a very ambitious project the first time you heard it pitched to you. How did you react to it? Was it immediately you just jumped at it that, oh, this is just awesome, or did you just have some time to like that this is something a bit different? Because I don't know of many organizations that kind of like have this widespread, especially linking with local companies, especially in Nigeria, the ones I'm familiar with. I think almost all the renewable energy or like solar companies are associated with your organization to some capacity. So it's really impressive, and I just imagine that the startup must have been a bit challenging
Well,
as
so
well.
it's funny because when I first got back to the United States, before I started working for Interpublic Group, the IPG marketing services company I told you about, I ran a small nonprofit for a year, and it was funded by grants and foundations. And so I'd been through one role in a nonprofit, and I swore to myself after that year that I would never do it again. Um, There's many reasons for that, which I'm happy to go into maybe on another podcast with you. But it's quite frustrating. I think there's a sort of built-in disincentive to collaborate within the nonprofit world. People are or organizations and people within those organizations can be quite territorial when it comes to their funding, which doesn't breed particularly. It's not a recipe for collaboration, and I'm all about collaboration. And so, largely because of the people who are involved with Power for All, I took another dive into the NGO nonprofit world, and the woman who founded the organization, Christina Skirka, she comes from the private sector like me, and I think she is, or the both of us are quite entrepreneurial and very much interested in looking at ways to collaborate. And I thought, Power for All had an opportunity to do that. There's plenty of gaps in the energy access world that need to be filled, and a campaign type approach that we took from the beginning, um, I think has an important role to play in filling some of those gaps and creating some of the connective tissue that currently lacks. I mean, what I call solution silos in the development world, in the nonprofit world, where everybody's got their blinders on, they're heads down, focused on this very narrow issue and topic, which is important. But unless you lift your head up and look around and understand what the linkages are with others working in different sectors, in different manners than you are, you're probably not going to achieve as quickly as you'd like the goal that you set out to achieve. So, Power for All for me was intriguing because it was structured as a campaign, fast moving, nimble, and if you want to tackle a big development issue, you certainly have to tackle some big structural issues, but you have to be able to adjust on the fly and try to invigorate a number of different organizations, institutions that are challenging to move. So it seemed like a great challenge, a great opportunity to get back into the energy world, but also to do it in places where I personally was quite interested in having more experience.
Hmm. Okay, so speaking of your experience, it's a very, I think you have a very unique set, spending so much time in China and now being in an organization that has association in countries in Asia and Africa. I'm sure it gives you a very interesting perspective of the conversation of energy access, because it's a different thing to talk about it when you've never been to countries that don't have electricity. So you can't really get a good perspective of what we're talking about, because I think to a certain degree, it becomes something that you don't really think about. You just kind of like take it for granted that electricity is always supposed to be everywhere, until you go to a place and you realize that, wow, electricity is kind of a big deal. So I just want to highlight a few countries that I'm more familiar with. China, India, and Nigeria, and some West African countries as well, or some East African ones. They all have very interesting energy developments right now. China, as you probably know, is they're still investing a lot into coal and other fossil fuel based energy, but just because of the sheer population that they have, they're also the largest investors in renewable energy. So it kind of gives this like dilemma that there's so many people that need energy, and they have to do all sorts of things to provide for them. And you move over to a place like India, where like so many people are just getting electricity for the first time through coal power plants, and you have countries like Nigeria that are so dependent on oil, and like they have a financial incentive not to move away from oil, and all these things just bring different nuances into the conversation about energy access. So from what you've done so far, from everything you've experienced, what do you think of the challenges that you've seen that kind of unify all these places together in terms of energy development and energy access as well, for the renewable side?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a couple of things stand out for me in terms of challenges that are universal within the energy sector. One is just the inertia in the system. Um, and when I say inertia, I mean, you've had a way of doing things for decades, based around fossil fuels, based around centralized systems and distribution and transmission. And everybody who has been trained in the energy sector has been trained to do things a certain way. The funders who support national governments to build energy systems have built their funding mechanisms to behave in a certain way. And so there's just a huge amount of inertia in the system. And just like, that terrible analogy that people use all the time around trying to turn the Titanic, it's very challenging to turn the energy sector. I mean, even with all of the radical changes that have happened in the last decade, with the rise of cheaper solar, with increased declines in cost of the battery solutions, fossil fuels and centralized systems and the subsidies that go into those, and the massive amounts of funding that still come to them from banks, development banks, and commercial banks is still phenomenal. And so, it's not a one generation thing typically to shift that inertia into a different direction. So that's, I think, one of the major challenges. And then part of that, and related to it, I think, is also a generational challenge. Because you have, in many countries around the world, people are making decisions about energy infrastructure and the future of their energy systems who come out of that older school of thinking, an older way of thinking. And so I think there's also a need for a generational change in leadership within the energy sector in order to really achieve liftoff the way we want to, and accelerate the shift in systems that is needed. So some of the things that Power for All is doing, or is trying to break down some of those forces of resistance. The Powering Jobs census that we put out for the first time this year, for the first time, is helping governments and funders understand that the delivery of electricity access through these decentralized renewable energy systems is not just only creating direct employment for the people in the companies that deliver that access, the MCOPAs, the B boxes, the Engazas, name any number of the companies that are they're doing quite well today. So not only is it a big employment opportunity for employment in those companies, but also within the communities they're gaining electricity access for the first time, to start new businesses, to scale and move away from diesel into solar and storage, to scale agricultural productivity, cold storage, agricultural processing, et cetera. So I think that we're trying to use that data in a way to shift the way people are thinking, and help them understand that there is an opportunity not just to create energy access, but to employ their people in meaningful ways with good jobs. Similarly, the work that we're doing with this project that we just launched in May called Utilities 2.0, and all this stuff's available on our website. But essentially, the idea is that if you're going to create or end energy poverty as quickly as possible, it can't be this binary view of the world where you've got centralized systems and decentralized systems, public systems and private systems that are working in parallel to one another and not collaborating. And so the idea behind Utilities 2.0 is to bring those pieces together, to create an integrated energy future where centralized utilities are working with decentralized private sector players, to identify new ways, new business models that can not only serve the regulatory mandates that often exist for the utilities to deliver electricity access, but can also help the private companies scale even further. So right now we're looking to demonstrate that concept in Uganda, working with the national utility there, Umeme, as well as several private sector companies to identify communities within the Umeme concession, to identify business models based on consumer demand research that we've done, and test those out, and then use the learnings hopefully to inform other utilities and other regulators in other countries, ways in which this blending of different approaches to energy systems and energy infrastructure can actually help us all achieve the goal of ending energy poverty. So, I think challenges are many, and there are any number of interventions that are required to address those challenges. But I think we've identified some. Obviously, we're not the only organization working on these issues. There are many organizations that are doing amazing things, many of whom we partner with. So it's certainly not something that Power for All is taking credit for doing. This is certainly not something that's exclusive to ourselves, but it takes a whole ecosystem of organizations to make this this challenge become an opportunity.
That's I think you broke those down very, very well. I would love to run through all of these one by one. I'm worried we'll run out of time, so I'll just see how far we can get to with these ones. So let's start with talking about the inertia that you mentioned in changing energy systems. We can just draw a parallel with countries in the developed world, European countries. You can just use Germany as an example. They're pushing really heavily into renewables, and because they have to make such drastic changes to their energy systems, like it's taken a long time for them to really adjust and to really go for it. And you have countries like the USA where it's a policy issue, and it's really causing a big debate whether if it's worth the investment or if it's not. And people are making very moral arguments for these. I think that's just a different case we can get into. But you have countries in the developed world, in the developing world, and it's a different case because you have a lot of people who don't have, either they don't have any access to energy at all, or they have very limited access and they use things like generators for themselves, and they have power outages on the regular, and these things is just like regular life for them. So there's an easier entry barrier into countries like these, and especially when they have such a strong incentive to want to develop, as you mentioned as well. And that also brings another conversation about like you mentioned that you and the founder of a powerful from the private side about really breaking it down into financial incentives. Let's just be blunt about investing into renewable energy, because most of the time people try to make very emotional arguments, and the problem with emotional argument, it's either a hit or miss. But everybody speaks business opportunities and everybody speaks money. So it's a strong difference between these two communities, how they react to things. But definitely, would you say that the largest opportunity for the growth for decentralized renewable energy is in developing countries right now?
Um, that's a great question. I don't think so. I mean, I think you look at any country right now, and even the United States, Germany, all of the energy systems are moving towards a digitized, distributed model. And that's not to say that the central grid doesn't play and shouldn't play an important role moving forward, but what you're seeing now is decentralized or distributed energy resources is what that's typically called DER in developed markets, where it's called decentralized renewable energy in the more developing markets. So DER or DRE is all moving in that direction. The digitization, the prosumer, the ability of consumers to become almost their own utility and manage their own energy is improving all the time. So I think that there's an opportunity, different opportunity, but equally as large in both types of countries, whether it's a more advanced economy or more emerging economy. And don't forget, I think that we're not. It's not as if we're reinventing the wheel in some cases. The United States, where I come from, it was very much for rural electrification anyway. It was an outside-in approach where you started with rural cooperatives that essentially built mini grids, microgrids for those rural communities that helped power agriculture, schools, businesses, local businesses, et cetera. And then those microgrids became interconnected with other microgrids, and then all of those interconnected microgrids eventually got integrated into the national or regional grid. And so, I think there the population density in the United States and those communities was also very dispersed, just like it is in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think that there's, a lot of similarities actually in the history of development of rural electrification in many countries, not just so what we're seeing happen in Cambodia or sub-Saharan Africa or China or wherever. It's not new. It's just that the systems that are helping to achieve it are new, and they're powered in a different way, and there's cheaper power storage, et cetera. So I would say that that's it's an opportunity globally. I think in some cases, the political economy that exists in developing countries between national governments and development banks and other donors, where they're trying to deploy huge amounts of capital, do not at all fit well with these smaller distributed systems that are being deployed. Right? Banks in the past have wanted to sign one deal where they deploy $100 million, $500 million to build one big energy infrastructure project, and they're not really set up to figure. They don't really understand how or what the mechanisms are to fund these types of distributed systems. So I think the challenges are different in emerging economies, but the opportunity I think is equal globally. And I think that this is a huge growth market for. I mean, if you want to just talk about Africa, China sure it has a huge amount of its primary energy still generated by coal, but 10 years ago, solar wasn't even on the radar in China, and now it's by far the largest installed base of solar in the world, and it just continues to grow. Same for wind. So the opportunity for change is there, and I think the opportunity for Africa is exceptionally strong, given the profile of many countries on the continent for solar and other renewable, including geothermal and wind. So I think it's going to take hopefully not as long as it did for the rest of the world. But I think that that's really from our perspective, we are seeing minds opening and pocketbooks opening to the opportunity for the increased role of renewable energy in Africa, which is super exciting. I think there's more that has to be done, but I think you're starting to see a momentum shift.
Hmm. Okay, that's actually very great to hear. So, talking a bit more about this generational change that you mentioned, as you said before, the most of the things that are happening now, like rural electrification and things that have happened before, but somehow it always seems to be so unfamiliar because the technology we're talking about is different this time. And I think that is why majority of renewable energy companies and renewable energy movements are led by younger people, and especially in in African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, lots of the CEOs popping up for local renewable energy companies are all pretty young people, and it just gives you this sense that there is this potential for really exponential growth in the sector. And I'll be honest, it's actually very exciting to see because for so long we've been kind of locked in place. And I think this is the first real disruption we've had in a very long time. I just give my country, Nigeria, as an example. I mean, we've had such strong oil markets. I use strong in quotes because that's largely debatable, but it's just the infrastructure developments have been really lax, and it's really a shame that it's gone on like this for so long, and now we're in a place where we need to further diversify, and we don't even have the good foundation to build on. So it's just
it's a really exciting time, I think, and it's also a very interesting time because lots of different things are popping up. So, as things pop up like this, and being in charge of communications for Power for All, and being like, I'm sure you talk to lots of people, and you also spend a lot of time monitoring social media reactions and all that. How do you think to get the balance between making an emotional argument for the things that you do and making a very principled business oriented argument? Because most of the time, especially on Twitter, it can get very with the peanut gallery or chipping in and everybody pretending to be energy policy expert. It's just a lot of I want to say noise and not actual substance behind it. So far, have you found any challenges finding that balance? And if you have found that balance, would you like to share so me and the listeners can kind of put it into how we talk to people and how we run our own organization and lives as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, as we've seen with politics globally, with this whole concept of fake news, you can slice and dice data almost in any way to create a what is so-called fact-based narrative, right? So on the one hand, evidence and data or what a fact, it becomes harder in today's social media world to know what's real and what's not. That said, it's that I don't want to undersell the importance of evidence and data, especially in policymaking. Because I'm going to assume, with the exception of our embarrassing president of the United States, who spends a lot of his time on social media, that many political leaders do not, and they actually base their policy decisions on informed input from private sector as well as their supporters. So, I think that you have to have that strong evidence base, and that's clearly been, I would say, a foundational element of Power for All. We have a research team led by my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Shirley, who's based in Nairobi, and she, has been an extremely strong advocate for building out that case of evidence with her team. But I think our Powering Jobs campaign is a good example of how we try to blend evidence with the mind. The evidence is something that it speaks to the person's brain and their mind, right? Whereas personal stories speak to a person's heart. And most data will point to the fact that people make decisions not based on fact, but on how they feel, right? So we don't want to leave the heart out of our campaign. And so for Powering Jobs, besides the census data that we're gathering, which says very clearly, okay, there's a link between employment and energy access, we also wanted to connect to people's hearts. And so we created this SDG 7 at Work photo series, where we've been asking our partner companies and other coalition members to send in photos of some of the individuals that they employ, with small personal tidbits about who they are and what they do. And we've been trying to highlight in a very personal way the connection with this idea that more jobs is good for the country, with actually seeing the faces of the humans who are actually being employed with those jobs. So I don't think you can sacrifice one or the other. I think they're both important. Certainly, they're important in our campaign, and I think that you have to figure out when to bring them to bear. I think who you're talking to certainly determines what kind of resources you want to put in front of them. Some people are just not going to be moved, though. I think that you have to understand also that history is going to pass some people by, and they're never going to sort of be willing to acknowledge what the future is going to bring. And don't waste your time on that. I think we're quite cognizant of the fact that there are naysayers, there are people who are detractors of what we're trying to do, that we're probably not going to convince. So we're going to spend our time identifying people who maybe are more neutral, who we think we can move towards having a more positive view of what we're doing. I just want to make sure that I make one point very clear. I think I've alluded to it earlier, which is that Power for All, we are for decentralized renewable energy solutions. we're not against anything. If you can make a case for other solutions that help achieve universal electricity access in a more uh, affordable, sustainable, reliable manner, as is dictated by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 7, great. We have no problem with that. So we're not enemies with anybody. We realize that the centralized grid has a hugely important role to play and will continue to. We just think that our solutions also equally have a important role to play. So anyway, I've run on, but hopefully that helps answer some of the questions that you had.
Oh, it definitely did. It definitely did. Yeah, I think I've run through everything that I had right now. So, have you spent some time in India while the organization worked there?
So since I joined Power4All, I've spent a lot of time in India.
So how has that been? How has it been on ground to be? Have you interacting with the local communities and seeing these projects actually go up? Like, can you give a story of like first-hand experience of what these projects actually mean to these communities?
Sure. So I was lucky enough to visit Jharkhand state in eastern the eastern part of India earlier this year. I visited a friend who runs a company called Melinda, and they put up mini grids. I think they've got about 30, probably more than 30 mini grids now in this state, serving rural communities. And when I was there, he was kind enough to take me around and show me five, six of the communities that they're powering through these mini grids. And so these are solar powered mini grids with a bank of batteries to store electricity for when for nighttime. Um, and it's quite amazing to see the impact that it has on. There was one steel worker who's really been able to scale his own home-based business around sharpening knives, making knives, and other steel work. To be able to power a furnace to heat the flame to melt the metal instead of doing it by hand, being able to do it with a pump powered by electricity. Um, you see entrepreneurs really thinking about how to scale all types of agricultural businesses there. One business that was started that helped the farmers in this one community plant a crop, canola, I think it might have been. It was an oil crop, and then turn that crop into a consumer product. They were actually pressing the oil. They bought a oil presser, powered it with this mini grid, created a brand out of the community, and then started selling it to local markets. This is having a real impact on income for families. It's appears to be reducing the amount of migration away from these communities and keeping people at home within these communities. It's increasing their monthly revenue. There's all kinds of benefits that you see on people's lives, and it is really impactful, especially when you realize that not long ago they were living on kerosene and maybe some polluting diesel. So it's wonderful to see that, and I've seen similar communities obviously in Africa, and it's just very powerful when you sort of compare before and after and what's possible.
Hmm. Yes, it really is, and I think that's just the key point. At the end of the day, what you're really doing is putting power in the hands of people to make their own lives better, because energy isn't just about having lights for your homes and having heat when it's cold. It's really about being able to give yourself more opportunities to grow your businesses, to learn more. I mean, my family, I was born in Nigeria. My family moved away, and I am here starting this podcast. And I know there are a few Americans and Europeans listening, not just people in the developing world. So it really affects the kind of opportunities you have. Imagine not having the access to the internet, not able to find out information. For example, I knew nothing about podcasting when I started, but because of the resources I always have the internet on, and I always have electricity. And I was able to go to Amazon, like order the equipment, so I have it sent to my home, like all these simple things that developed worlds have taken for granted are things that people are just getting for the first time. And I try not to make my arguments too emotional when talking about energy access, but I think this is something people have to realize as well, because this is about giving people opportunities they never had to make their own lives better. And I think that's the really powerful thing about what you guys are doing. And I really appreciate what the organization stands for. And I'm so grateful to have you on for this conversation.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's great that you're able to, to reach out to your audience through this podcast. I encourage all of your listeners, especially young people, to learn more about what's happening in their countries. And realize that there's opportunities not just on the technical side, but on the soft skills side too. This is a growing industry, from middle management down to sales and finance. There are opportunities for a lot of young people to benefit from the sector directly, but also from accessing the electricity that these companies are providing. So thanks to you, I mean, for highlighting this issue, and we'll be listening for more in the future.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation you just listened to with William. And something I think is really important is as long as we're talking about what these technologies mean and how they are like meeting the goals they're supposed to meet, it's important to realize also the actual impact these technologies have, and the actual impact that renewable energy companies have and solar's been having in rural parts of Africa in the past few years, and rural parts of India, and especially in China. That this is about giving people the power to lift themselves out of bad situations. It's about making them able to compete and grow their businesses. It's about empowering people. It's not just about lights in their homes. It's what that can lead to. It's what electricity can help you developing yourself. So I'm so glad I was able to have this conversation, and I hope it's something we have more on the podcast, to have actual impacts of the technologies and to see that lots of people are working very hard to solve the problems we have. And don't get me wrong, we're still a very long way. It has a lot of moving parts. It has this one, and it has like the all majors, and it has other things and policy and government, but people are working very hard every day to solve these problems. And I hope to have more people like William on the podcast in the future. So thank you so much for joining us this week. I hope you really enjoyed this conversation, and most importantly, I hope you've learned something from this conversation. So we'll be back again next week with another conversation about the energy industry, and next week is going to be quite a bit of a change from what you're used to. So next week we're having Anna Mikulska on the podcast to talk to us about energy security in European countries, in the USA, and developed countries in general, and talk about what's driving the move away from coal while countries still use coal, and what we can expect from the future of energy in terms of energy security. So I look forward to that conversation and sharing it with you, and I hope you guys have a lovely week. This has been your host, Olajide, signing off.